All right, yeah, so I'm Ken Vlieger. I live in Huron, South Dakota. I consider myself a South Dakota native, although I was born in southwestern Minnesota, but I only lived there for the first 2 years of my life. So most of my family, extended family, actually still lives southwestern Minnesota, northwestern Iowa. So the story is my great-great-grandparents immigrated from the Netherlands. They went to Orange City, Iowa. And then my grandparents moved to southwest Minnesota because the land was cheaper. And then my parents moved to South Dakota because the land was cheaper. I have kind of stopped that. I don't necessarily want to keep moving where the land is cheaper. So I'm going to talk pretty quickly today. This is kind of an hour-long plus presentation that I'm going to condense into a much shorter time frame and hopefully leave time for questions at the end. If we do run out of time for questions, I will be at the discussion roundtable event that they're going to have after supper tonight. I won't specifically have a table where I'll be set at, but if you have questions, you can certainly look for the short, bald guy in the room and ask me any questions you might have then. Okay, so this is me. I am much younger. I am on my grandfather's farm here at this time. And so take a picture of that in your mind's eye of what I'm doing there with my face and my tongue. So this was before the days where you could just snap a photo, look at it, I don't like that, delete or edit or whatever. So much to my mother's chagrin, I have lots of photos like this growing up. Any of you have mothers or are mothers that tend to save everything from your child's growing up? Anyone? No one willing? Well, I got one willing to admit it. So my mother saved everything, lots of things. And so several Christmases ago, she came up to me with a large box full of stuff, and she said, "Here, this is all yours." And I didn't really know what it was. I opened the lid, and it was full of all these papers and stuff from, grade school, something I may have gotten a good grade on, or a sticker or a good comment from a teacher, or something that she just liked. And so this is something that I do not remember writing. But this would have been from the same age that this picture was taken when I wrote this. And so I'll read it for you in case you can't read my handwriting. So it says, "When I grow up, I want to be a soil conservationist. I want to do this because my dad is one, and it sounds like a lot of fun to tell farmers how to get their soil so that it can grow plant better, and how deep to dig wells for their animals." So I will tell you one thing, my grammar has improved greatly. My handwriting may actually be worse. So just a little bit about myself. So mostly agriculture in the background of both sides of my family tree. So I started with the NRCS, kind of followed the same career path my dad had. I started my career in northern North Dakota, a little town called Mohall, which is northwest of Minot. It's a Canadian border county. So I really kind of got my feet wet into different cropping systems. I then moved further south in North Dakota, a small town called Lemoore, which is south of Jamestown, right in the James River Valley of North Dakota. Pretty much corn, soybean country. And then from there I moved to Huron, South Dakota, and have been there since 2007. I was the district conservationist for Beetle County and Sanborn County. And then not quite 6 years ago, I came on with this position as state soil health specialist. So I work with producers. I do a lot of education on soil health, the principles of soil health and what we do. But in my somewhat free time, I guess you can say, my hobby, maybe a little bit more than a hobby, I like to do gardening. And started a community garden associated with my church that had quite a large plot of land that was basically just being mowed every day, or mowed every week during the summer. So remember that picture I showed you of me? This is my payback. This is my youngest, this is my son Luke. This picture is a couple years old, but so yeah, it's kind of a family thing that we do with gardening. All right, so I gave a similar presentation to a large master gardeners group in Sioux Falls at Augustana University, not quite, well, close to 2 years ago. And when I put this slide up there, and I saw lots of looks on people's faces because people kind of like their rototiller, right? Especially gardeners. And so I asked, how many people have one of these or utilize one of these, and it was almost 100% hands went up. And so then I did this. And they were very polite, but if we were in a less polite part of the world, I probably would have got booed out of there and wouldn't be able to finish my discussion. So, so I asked, why do we do this? And, a couple comments got thrown up. It's to aerate the soil to let water in better. It's to cycle nutrients. It's to do this, that, and the other. And then over the course of that presentation, I basically said, well, we were kind of wrong on a lot of that. Really, the only real reason we do it now is to make maybe planting a little bit easier. And then I also, a lady in the audience said what I was going to segue into, and she goes, I just love doing it because I love the smell of that fresh worked earth. And so I said, oh, that's a perfect segue for this. And so do any of you know what that's actually called, that smell of fresh worked earth? It actually has a name. Anyone? I see some heads, some wheels turning. It's called geosmin. And so it's Geosmin. It's kind of like, almost pronounced like jasmine. So humans are able to detect that smell at very, very, very small levels. And so something inherently that is in our genes that like that smell. And it's usually that healthy, fresh worked smell of soil. So you don't need to work the soil to get that smell, however. Yes, this is real. This is not made up. You can actually purchase that fragrance. So get rid of this, and if you're doing it just for the smell, hop online and buy some of that. And you can have it 365 days a year. Okay, so let's go through this. This is something I'm not going to get too techy or nerdy with you here today, but this is something that I ran across. I get lots of stuff sometimes sent to me from friends or producers, and someone ran across this article and sent it to me. And so there is something called ergothioneine, and basically it's something that's produced by fungus in the soil, and it's think of it like an antioxidant. It's something important that we as humans need. It's one of those many things in plants. It's not a vitamin. It's not going to be on the side of your multivitamin that you need to take, but it's important for the health of our bodies. The only way we can get this ergothioneine is through eating plants or eating food. Okay, but the plants don't produce it. The fungus produces it, and it's in the soil. And so this fungus produces it, the plants uptake it, and then we can then eat the plant and get that ergothioneine, or we can eat an animal that has eaten that plant and still get some of the same amount of levels. So what this study did is it looked at the ergothioneine level in different types of management systems. One was no-till, one was a chisel disc, and one was moldboard plow. So basically from virtually zero disturbance to pretty heavy disturbance. And it shows what happens to the ergothioneine content as we have more intensive tillage. And basically the long and short of it is that if the ergothioneine content is decreasing, we know that the fungal community in that soil is decreasing because there's less production of the ergothioneine. And so tillage is disturbing those fungal communities. And they don't like disturbance. They don't like it any more than you or I if we were to have an earthquake knock down our house. Okay, if that kept happening year after year after year, you'd probably move to different parts of the country. Okay, every time we are tilling the soil, we are getting rid of those fungal networks. Makes it harder for them to survive. They have to regrow, and eventually we're just going to degrade their populations. Okay, so that's as techy and nerdy as we're going to get for today. I'd be remiss with my profession if I did not bring this up. We have great online access to our soils data in the United States. We're fortunate to have virtually most of our country is mapped. Some of it's still in the process, but for the most part, everything is mapped. In South Dakota, we're really lucky. We've got just about everything mapped. There's some things that are being reworked, but we're mostly mapped. So you can go online, and you can learn most of what you want about the soils wherever you are. You can just do it the Google Earth way and just zoom in to where you are, and then you just highlight the area you want to look at, and then it will bring up all sorts of data for you to look at. So it'll tell you, potential water holding capacity. It'll tell you, give you an estimate of what the soil organic matter level might be. It will even tell you if it's good for building a house on and all sorts of other things, putting in septic systems. So lots of information available there. Web Soil Survey, if you're not familiar with it, I would encourage you to go there and look. It can actually save you a little bit of heartache and pain if you're establishing a garden, for example. It can say, hey, maybe this place isn't the best place to start your garden, or you might have these difficulties. Maybe reconsider, or just know if you're going to be planting there that you're going to need to be looking at certain things management-wise to remediate that. Okay, Principles of soil health. Hopefully a lot of you know these. You're at this conference. Maybe you're kind of already a believer. If you're here to learn, these are the 5 principles. If you learn nothing else from me today, remember these 5 principles, because everyone's going to apply them differently. Whether you're a corn, soybean, row crop farmer, or you're a smaller scale, localized production, kind of like myself and some of our specialty crop producers. If you can integrate these 5 principles into your production system, that's how you start to build your healthy soils, and then you start to get all the additional benefits that roll along with it. Okay, so we're going to cover these in different ways, and you'll see how we do that as I go through how I manage my garden. A lot of these we can picture how we manage in a garden setting. My garden is in the city limits of Huron, so there's ways to keep the soil covered, minimize disturbance, have good plant diversity in my garden, have a continual living root. Livestock integration tends to be the tricky one if you're in city limits in some towns. So for example, in Huron city limits, city code does not allow you to have any form of livestock, and that includes poultry, so I cannot have chickens in town. It's interesting. Some towns do allow it. Even larger municipalities throughout South Dakota allow you to have chickens, but in Huron, it's not allowed. So we'll talk about how I kind of cheat and integrate livestock in a roundabout way into my system. Okay, so this is an aerial photo of the church I attend and the large property. The property actually extends quite a bit further to the west. This is the central plot that myself and my family operate. It's basically 75 feet by 100 feet. So it's, roughly 1/5 of an acre, give or take. And this is all the plots surrounding there. So right now we currently have 68 plots that are free and available to community members. Basically anyone in Huron is free to, but for the most part it's these plots are occupied by low-income community. We have low-income housing and apartments. That's pretty common around our church area. And most of the population that has these plots are political refugees from South Central, Southeastern Asia. It's Karen. The Karen group is their name. It's spelled just like the name Karen. And so they're mostly from Burma, Thailand, that part of the world. And so that's mostly who has a lot of these plots. And so you're going to see some of the interesting ways that they produce some of their own food. And I've learned a lot from them, and I'm hoping they're learning a little bit from me. Okay, so this is just a quick diagram of typically what the garden area would look like in any given year. So I'm going to point out a few of the highlights and some things that I think are important, and something that we as gardeners or market gardeners, or if you're selling this at the market garden at the market, for example, we don't sometimes think about. So you'll notice I've got basically the perimeter of the garden is planted with flowering and fruit-bearing shrubs. So I've got elderberry, plum, hedgerows along one side, aronia berry, buffalo berry along here, and then grapes along one side. So those serve multiple purposes. Obviously, they produce fruit, which is great. They flower, so then we're increasing our beneficials that are there, a lot of our pollinators. They also do something else important. So in South Dakota, we get those heavy thunderstorms that roll through June, July, and August, and there's a lot of wind that comes associated with it. They provide just enough wind protection where most storm events, I don't really get a lot of wind damage. During the most severe ones, we're still going to get some, but they do provide some wind protection during those severe events. And they also provide some wind protection during those hot, dry, windy south wind days. And so there's just some benefits, and everything seems to work really, really quite well. We utilize the elderberry, the plum, the aronia, the buffalo berry, and the grapes. We don't necessarily utilize the hedgerows, but there is a lady in the community that now basically comes and harvests the rose hips in the fall after a frost, and she uses them to make teas. So not really my cup of tea, but it is for her. Sorry that. So we got the apples also, and we don't have a lot of apple trees. We've actually got 12 that are out there. Some of them are just some pretty common varieties that you can get from your conservation district. We do have two of the apple trees that I took cuttings from an old abandoned farmstead in the county that I drove by a lot when I had my field office job. And so I have no idea what varieties they are, but they are my favorites. So that's basically what our garden looks like. Sweet corn, beans, cover crop. You're going to see pictures of all this coming up shortly. We've got a large area with the tomatoes, the peppers, the eggplants, some leafy greens, and some others. And then we have a whole area basically with the vining type plants. That's the melon, squash, pumpkins, and then some cut flowers that we've gotten into a little bit too. Okay, so I'm going to take you through basically a season and how this looks. And so that same group I talked to at Augustana University here a couple of years ago, when I showed this slide of what the garden looks like in the spring before we're doing anything, there were audible gasps in the crowd. And so I kind of had to talk them down off the ledge a little bit. This is basically a quarter of my production area gets planted to a full season 16 to 18 species cover crop mix every single year. So a lot of people say, man, that's a quarter of your garden that is basically being sacrificed or has no production. Well, that's kind of true, but it's really critical to the rest of the years and the sequence of how I rotate. And you'll see that going on. So this is a lot of biomass that's created, a lot of fertility. There's a lot of legumes in there, both warm season and cool seasons, some clovers, cowpeas, peas, some sun hemp, that kind of things that are fixing nitrogen for me. And most of the biomass that you see here that's kind of laying down and is visible is pearl millet, and that's kind of my key biomass producer. Okay, so this is what that looks like after I take our church's large, we have a larger batwing mower, and what I do is the first pass I will raise the deck as high as I can, turn the blades off, and I just knock everything down. Second pass I'll lower it to basically half the height, I'll turn the blades on and chop a little bit, and then I'll lower it another inch or two and chop it again, and it just leaves a really nice thick mulch, usually 6 to 8 inches deep. And that is my ground cover for all of my melons and squash and vining plants, and then some of the flowers that we then grow the following year. So that really thick ground cover that's out there. I don't have a real great picture of what it looks like basically at the end of the season, but most of that 6 to 8 inches of mulch by the end of the growing season is gone. So it is through biology getting digested and hopefully getting cycled back into the soil to provide fertility. Okay, this is like the tomatoes, the eggplants, the peppers, all those things that had to grow in nice rows. So I do use a landscape fabric that is biodegradable. The landscape fabrics that are out there that are biodegradable and kind of plastic-like, they're okay. I've used some varieties that I first started using were supposed to biodegrade over the course of 2 years, and I found they took usually 5 years before they were gone. The ones that I'm using now are out of a soybean oil or canola oil that they're making these out of, and they tend to degrade a little bit quicker. They're still not perfect, but they do degrade over time. And what I do is I lay drip irrigation down, and then I put the fabric over, and then we plant our seedlings into there. But you can see I do have ground cover in between here, and that's a living cover that you're going to see, and that's just a really simple mixture of annual ryegrass and a couple of clovers. This is my sweet corn system. So this is actually tree fabric, if you're familiar with Conservation District tree fabric. And I have been using this. It's 12 years old now, and I just keep on reusing it, and so that gets shifted around. I'm getting away from using that. It works really well at 100% weed control, of course, but I'm moving more towards a living ground cover just because I think we've reduced our seed bank enough where I shouldn't have to worry too much about controlling the weeds there. Okay, this is a close-up. The drawback of this is, yes, it does have to be moved every year. That's probably our most labor-intensive part between my kids and I. And then also the way we plant our corn is basically by hand. We can go out there, our ground is mellow enough, I can just push the seeds into the ground. So it works well that way. The thing that I would recommend if you're looking at this for an option is don't create the holes the way we did with a box cutter and just cutting an X, because you can see what happens over the years if you're going to be reusing this. It's really starting to fray, and some of those holes are getting pretty big. Producer that saw my presentation here not too long ago, I think it was this past fall, he recommended going along and basically melting them with a torch, and basically just seals that, which would have been the smarter thing to do, but I did not think that far ahead when I did it. So there's my workforce. Those are my 3 kids. This was taken a couple of years ago. These 2 girls are now driving, so if you're in Huron, just be careful. So really, we don't have, and you can really tell this was a couple of years ago because our plum shrubs are not. Now they're 8 feet tall and filled in there. So you can see we really, it's pretty labor intensive for basically like a whole Saturday and then maybe part of a next Saturday. So we clean up, we cut down all the corn stalks, we pile them, we lift up the fabric and we move that to the next part in the rotation and staple it back down. So that's kind of what we do there to manage that part. Many of you probably wondered how I do my cover cropping. What I do is I broadcast my cover crop mix right on top of the ground, and then I cover it with a real fine layer of compost. So I do have a smaller garden behind my house, just in my backyard, like many of you might. And I make my own compost for my home garden, and I basically use a Johnson Sioux composting. And so I've been doing that before I even knew really what Johnson Sioux composting was. I kind of consider it the lazy man's composting. You don't have to turn, you don't have to really do any of the measuring with a thermometer, and when it reaches its temperature, you turn it with a fork or somehow do that. Basically what this is, it's a slower composting. It's not thermal, so it doesn't get hot, or you don't want it to get hot. And the reason you have these tubes in here is you're creating this airspace in there so it stays aerobic. And it's really just kind of, I just throw kitchen scraps in there. I throw last year's garden leftovers that are in there. I'll use some of my yard clippings. You'll see what kind of yard I have here soon. And I'll use leaves. Sometimes I'll use all my own. If I don't have enough of that, I'll take some of my neighbors. So Johnson Sioux makes a really good compost. It's a little bit different texture than what you might be familiar with if you buy compost from a garden store, or if your community makes composting through thermal. The thermal is a little bit lighter weight, a little easier to spread, to be honest. The Johnson Sioux, in my experience, has a little heavier texture. Some people say it's kind of clay-like, but it's not quite that dense. It's just a little tougher to spread, but it's more fungal-based, has more biodiversity in its critters in there than the thermal composting. Because the thermal composting, as you can imagine, gets hot or gets to a certain temperature, and only certain species are going to survive that. You won't be able to see this very well. If you can look at the slide deck later, if we get that posted. I've got circled what it kind of looks like. It's a little bit clumpy. And this is my home garden. I'm just showing kind of here what the surface of my garden looks like at home. Yeah, it's a little bit clumpier. I can really only produce enough compost to cover my home smaller garden, which is about 15 feet by 15 feet. The garden that I have associated with our church, the much larger one, where I'm spreading the compost over the broadcast cover crop seed, I get that from the city. So Huron's been doing its own thermal composting for the better part of 20 years. They do a really good job of it. Basically, this is the method they use. This isn't them. This is just a picture I found online. But this is basically what their rows look like. They thermal compost lots of yard waste, pretty much all the yard waste, trees, tree branches that get brought in that they chip and put in there. And they also take some waste from the turkey processing plant in Huron, and that is mixed in there too. So it's really high quality, and they do a really good job. They do such a good job that a couple of years ago I went to get my pickup load to do the community garden, and the lady at the weigh scale said, "Sorry, we're all out." I said, "What do you mean you're all out? You always have mountains of this stuff." A local producer actually came and purchased, it was like 75 semi-trailer loads full of it, and because they caught on to it, and their agronomist says, "You should buy that, it's so cheap." And so that was good for them, bad for everyone in the community. They got enough feedback from the community that they don't do that anymore. But So yeah, it's really good quality, and they give you a report. This is what it looks like spread out, and so I broadcast that cover crop seed, and we spread a thin layer. It's about 1/4 inch thick. You can kind of see that's a close-up of what it looks like when it's spread, and it does really well. That's basically my fertility program, is the compost and then the cover crop, and then there's a sequence of 3 years before that takes place again. If you're using compost that's bought from your city, I encourage you to get the report. My understanding is that most municipalities have to give you the report of the testing on it. The main reason that you want to get the report from them is this first page on Hurons, for example. It lists all the potential bad guys that can be in there. So this is all the chemicals. So you'll see it's got 2,4-D, dicamba. It's got heavy metals on there too that will be on following pages. So you can see on here there's nothing detected, nothing detected, nothing detected, except for on the 2,4-D is 0.011. That would have been 2022 is when that was. So that is actually the highest I've ever seen that test come back from them. I have never had any production issues with it. And the rest of the analysis is such high quality that I basically kind of turned a blind eye to it. So I cannot produce enough of my own compost to make, so I purchase it from them, and it's really quite cheap. But you can look through here. We don't have time to go through all of these, but everything is really, really quite good. The only thing that I am running into is some of my soil test levels on my potassium are starting to get a little bit elevated, so I'm going to be backing off on my compost program. I'll just spread it thinner is my goal here going forward. Okay, so we're going to go through a sequence here of what the garden looks like throughout a growing season. This is the cover crop mix. This is those rows of eggplants, tomatoes, peppers, that kind of thing. So this is my sweet corn, and this is 2022. Doesn't look very good, does it? It's pretty spotty, right? So any of you in Huron towards the southeast, what happened in 22? We had 2 major events. We had 2 derechos that rolled through. So the first one was in May. No problem there, didn't affect it. The last one was in early July, and it really did a number on my corn. But you're going to see from later pictures, it did bounce back quite well. Okay, this is in between the rows. That's my annual ryegrass and clover mix. So what I do is, depending on the year, if I'm getting plentiful rainfall and that in-between row mix is getting a little too aggressive, I will mow it down. I just have a reel mower, and either I or my son or daughter just goes through there quick and mows it down. We do occasionally, we do have some weeds in there, but they never go to seed. So we mow them down if they ever are in there. And that's really the only place in my garden where I have any potential weed escapes that can take place. But they're more or less controlled by the mowing if we have to. Okay, so this is a sequence of the cover crop as it's growing, growing, growing. Just keeps growing there. And this is right before we would have mowed that living cover between the rows. Okay, some of you that have seen this presentation before don't say what this is. Does anyone know what that is circled right here? I'm hearing some people whisper that it's a hornworm, tomato hornworm, and you're incorrect. Hummingbird moth, yes, the white sphinx moth. Okay, and do you see what kind of weed it is eating? Purslane, right. So I do have purslane. Purslane is probably the weed I have most in my garden, but it doesn't really concern me. I don't consider it to be too aggressive. I don't really think that it hinders really much growth of my production plants. And it also happens to be one of the main food sources of that moth. So it's just something fun. That's my daughter's hand there. She's kind of she's the fearless one with bugs and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's the hummingbird moth, which is what I grew up calling it, but yeah, it's the white sphinx moth. Okay, this is what the vining or the squash and the melons area looks like. So people often ask me if I have problems with pests with all the residue I leave on the surface and my no-till system. I really don't have any issues, major issues with pests. There are 2 that I do have issues with, though. I found a way to avoid the one, and that is the stem borer moth for my squash. I went through several years where I lost just about 100% of my crop. What I learned, and this was from Jonathan Lundgren, I heard him speak, and he wasn't talking about this at all, but it happened to be, he mentioned the stem borer moth at a talk I heard him, and he said, well, they kind of have a flight time when the moths are laying their eggs, and if you can miss that flight time, then you can avoid having that pest. And so I said, well, duh, all I've got to do is plant later. And so I do not plant my squash or melons until June 15th. So I know many of you saying that's getting a little late, you're losing production. You're right, I am losing production on the end unless I have a really long fall, but it's better than having zero production. So that was my major pest that I did have, and I've pretty much 100% avoided that now. Even if they fly a little bit later, they need a certain diameter of stem to land on, I've learned. And so usually that my stem is too small for the moth to lay its eggs on. The other pest that I still struggle with is basically the squash bug, or those stink bugs. I do have those. My management plan for those is basically garter snakes. I have learned that they really consume those, and with all my cover and the fabric that I grow my sweet corn in, they really like to overwinter underneath there, and then in also some of the gopher holes that might be around. So we have quite the garter snake population in there, which keeps my wife out of there for most of the year. So I would love her help in there, but not so much with the snake. So this is that sweet corn area that got really kind of beat up by that derecho that happened early July last year, or in 2022. And what I'm trying to show here is, this is kind of a separate talk, but I included it in here because I think it should interest people. I have wider rows between my, row spacing between my rows of sweet corn. And I have pretty good spacing between plants within there. If you looked at there, I have holes that they weren't as close as most people would plant them. I do that for a couple reasons. My soil is really sandy. It's a shoe, loamy fine sand. And shoe is typically kind of in a wetter area, but this is in town. It's been basically drained, so it's really sandy. So drought is a concern for me. I do have access to water, but I want to kind of be frugal with that. So by planting my plants further apart, helps to address that. And also you get what you can see here. If you're using some of the earlier varieties, what you'll find is if you give that corn enough space to grow, it will, on most years, grow 3 stems. You've got the main and then the 2 sisters that will grow up off there. The main one will grow the 2 nice ears that you're going to buy from the back of someone's pickup in town. And then the 2 sisters will grow 2 smaller ears on there. So basically from one plant I get 6 ears of corn. So 4 of those ears are a little smaller than people would want to sell, but they're perfectly fine for my family and I. Thanks. Okay, so this is advancing on further on in the year. You can see there's my cover crop. There's all the biomass. You can also see I have sunflowers and things that flower in there to benefit our beneficials and the pollinators. And I included this picture in here just because it's a really nice one at sunset. So, but I will show, you can see a lot of the diversity in the mix. Some of the, basically you're seeing a lot of the pearl millet in a lot of the photos. Here you can see the sunflowers, you can see the pearl millet, you can see the oats that have gone to seed. You see hairy vetch, you see buckwheat, you see some of the mustards and canolas that are in there. Really a high diversity plant mix. This is just some of this. What I wanted to show here was not my son pointing at something, but look at the fabric. This is some of the older varieties or older brands of that biodegradable plastic. And this stuff is several years old, showing here. And you can see it's kind of fragile and cracked, but it really took a while to degrade. And if I'm honest, most of it blew away before it really degraded. So it wasn't perfect, but they're getting better. So this is some of the gardening methods for the Karen people. You can see they're really good at basically stacking vertically. And so they grow a lot of leafy greens, a lot of brassica type plants that they harvest several cycles of throughout the year. And they also grow a lot of pole beans and peppers. And so a lot of their herbs and leafy greens don't necessarily like it hot. And so what they do is they have this trellis system that they will create out of just about anything, which you can kind of see here. And we'll get a little bit more of a close-up. So it's old tree branches, and they'll find old pipes and everything. But Basically, it canopies with their vining plants like the beans, and then they grow squash. They don't grow the squash for the big squash like we will. They grow it for the flowers. They harvest the flowers and then stuff the flowers and eat those. So, but that will canopy over there, and it will shade all their herbs and the leafy greens below there to tolerate the summer heat. And basically, they've got 2 layers of garden to stack their production. Okay, I'll cruise through this. It's just a photo of, fortunately, I've got some nice toys at work that I can take pictures of. And so this is our, the AMF, the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. You can see right there, this is a root here of, this would be medium red clover. And then you can see the rhizobium where it's fixing nitrogen. There's a nice wormhole that's in the sand, so some people will say that the worms won't make it into the sands, but I have quite the worm population in my sandy soil. These are some soil tests, and this is really kind of the world I live in. So what I'm showing you is the very first year that I soil tested in this garden plot, and then this is last spring. So what I've circled here is some of the highlights. This is the organic matter was 1.7%. We are now sitting at 6%. Keep in mind, this is in a quite sandy soil, so that is pretty high. So we're advancing along that, and I attribute that all to the cover crop system, my no-till system, and then, of course, the compost. Phosphorus levels, you can see, really quite low. The parts per million were 3 first year, and now they're just shy of 19 parts per million, which is on the high side, as you can see here. And potassium, lower here, 175 parts per million. And here's where you can say I mentioned it's getting high, so it's very high, 612. So that's something I'm going to have to manage a little bit. And I know that potassium number is getting high because of my compost I'm adding. So I'm going to need to reduce my use of that a little bit. And then the last thing is pH. The pH was on the higher side, but not way out of the range for what you can see in South Dakota soil, 7.9 for a pH. And now we're sitting there kind of right in that sweet spot zone of 6.8. That's kind of the area you like to see it to basically optimal release of nutrients and availability for your plants. Okay, real quick, we've got a few minutes left. Landscaping too, so this is my house. Basically everything is native landscaped, not 100%, but it's mostly native landscaped. What I'm going to show you here is just 2 years, so 2019. Remember what 2019 was like for precipitation? It was a lot. We had 40 inches almost in May through August in Huron, which was like 2 years worth in a matter of 4 months. So this is 2019. This is 2 years later. 2021 was really quite dry. You don't really notice a whole ton of difference, do you? Native landscaping, basically the native plants just said, throw whatever you can at us. So we've got a lot of native plants. My yard is buffalo grass. So the buffalo grass, not necessarily for everyone's yard. Most of my neighbors think I'm bat crap crazy. And I get comments all the time in the spring of people walking by our house thinking that I accidentally sprayed out my whole lawn. Because it does not really green up until late May. But then it really does grow quite well. I don't have to water it. I do not fertilize it. It just grows, and I think it's a really nice. I like it. It's a different green color, but it looks really nice. Quite thick. Takes a lot of traffic quite well. I got 3 kids that are running around there. So here's just some fun pictures of native landscaping. Can anyone identify this plant? It's not common for this part of the state. Not super common really anywhere, but it'd be more eastern. I guess it's a native plant. It's called Culver's root. I just stumbled across it on some site and ordered a couple plugs of it. I found out that our bumblebees really like this plant. And it tends to flower later on in the season, so August through September. Okay, anyone know what kind of caterpillar that is? It's eating parsley. That'll give you a hint. So we grow parsley. None of one in my family eats parsley, but we grow it just because of this caterpillar, because it's my favorite butterfly. And this is the swallowtail butterfly. And this is the black phase of it. There's also the yellow, which is a little more common. And then I also grow some interesting, this is just interesting kind of ornamental varieties of sweet corn. And I've got some up there. I am breeding just to get really dark ruby red color, and I'm really getting close. Basically, it's just flint corn, and what will happen is we're going to grind that for just some corn flour for our family. So that's it. That's a picture of my free laborers. They're mostly in a good mood when we do this, but my girls are getting a little older, and they maybe don't enjoy it as much as they used to. So with that, I will open up to questions. These are just some of the fun dry beans that I grow, and I'm willing to talk with anyone that has questions about those too. So I will be at the table discussion tonight after supper. I won't have a specific table, but if you have questions, you can certainly find me there, and love to talk with any of you. So, sure.
Where do you get your cover crop seed?
You can get it from just about any seed dealer. I get mine from Milborn Seed. Now it's Milborn Renovo or some kind of combination, but so that's where I get mine. But you can get them. Just you can get it. You can get it online. You can get it from just most of your ag co-ops, even local ones, will be able to get cover crop seed for you. I'm not using any weird varieties of cover crops. It's just a diverse mixture. And I'll purchase a 50-pound bag, and that'll last me 3 years. I keep it cool and dry in my basement. And so basically I get 3 years worth with that 50-pound bag. Yep,
so
go ahead.
I tried to cover crop in the fall.
Yep.
And of course, our seasons, I live here, and so our season is different.
It's shortened,
so
yep.
It's shorter. And so I guess I'm probably going to have to do a quarter of, summer fallow for a...
Yeah, you can still get some good fall growth, but you're just limiting your growing season. It can still work for you. You don't have to go a full season like I do. You need to be kind of prepared for how to manage that the following year. So while I would encourage you to do it, make sure you have a plan for what you're going to follow that with the next year. Yeah. You get your hand up.
So the color of the fabric, it helps warm up in the spring, but is the temperature get too warm underneath?
No, it really doesn't. So what I'll do is I have the cover crop year. That's followed by the melons and squash, and then that is followed by the sweet corn. So there is still some of that residue left over there, but really no, that fabric doesn't warm. It shades the ground, actually, is what happens. It doesn't make the ground heat up more. It actually shades the ground from direct sunlight. So the fabric will be hot itself, but if you put your hand in the soil below, it'll be cooler.
Does it kind of rain underneath? Moisture?
No, so it's water does go through it. It's not a solid fabric, so it breathes air and it lets water in and out. So yep.
Yeah, it's just integrated.
Yep, there you go. It's woven. Yep, it's woven. Yep, she used a better description than I did. Sure, we'll go with you.
I have a two-part question. Have you noticed, or do you have any preference between like a raised bed and just a non-raised bed? And if you're working in a brand new area
Yep.
that already has, just say, some grasses there, what's the best way to get rid of that to start doing something?
Okay, so there's a couple ways. So I got fortunate or unfortunate with this area that I started here. When they constructed the church, it was still kind of bare from construction. So that's basically where I started it. It created some compaction issues early on, but those have been remediated. So I got lucky there. A couple ways if you've just got a bare lawn or grass area. So one easy way to do it would just be a chemical kill. That's an option. And it's quick and you can plant right away that year. Another option would be through occultation. So that basically you could use that dark fabric there. That maybe is going to take you a season to kill everything underneath there, and you need to make sure it's flat and no light's getting through. And another way is basically solarization. That's using a clear fabric or a clear plastic, and basically you're just going to cook those plants. They're going to start up and grow, but it's going to get really hot underneath there, and you make sure that all the edges are sealed, so it really bakes them. Solarization, you can get some loss of the soil life because it's going to get really hot in that top zone, so might not be an option if that's something you want to protect. But yeah, those are mostly your options. The other options would be to really go in there with a rototiller and just kind of work it over and turn it. Cardboard is another way. That's, yep, occultation is. Yep. So the cardboard option is essentially another way of the occultation. So basically it's 100% shade. Yep. Sure.
You had said something about don't plant your squash in
something else before June 15th?
Yep, so basically any of my vining plants, my squash, my melons. And so that might be different for whatever part of the state you might live in. But June 15th I found is the sweet spot for that. And I'm doing it strictly to mostly avoid the stem borer moth. Yep.
Do you plant plants or seeds?
Seeds.
Do you plant
Yep.
seeds?
Yep.
Have you tried
Yes.
to make tea out of your compost to make the spread?
I have. I do that mostly with at my home garden. I don't do it on the larger one. It's mostly just a time. Don't have time to do it, or the facilities. So.
You have to keep your Johnson soup from freezing, right?
I do. So that photo I showed you is actually what I have. It's basically just a big block. Mine freezes. I create mine all summer through the fall, and then it sits there all winter, and then I just spread it. So ideally you wouldn't want it to freeze because you want to maintain that life that's in there, but that's what I do.
Kansas
Yep.
told me that, so it's probably
Yep.
irrelevant.
Yep. It doesn't freeze in Kansas, does it?
Right.
Yeah, sure.
What's the rotation on crops?
So the rotation is cover crop, the vining plants, which are the melons, squash, that kind of thing. And then following the vining crops, I go to the sweet corn. And then following that is the tomatoes, the eggplants, the peppers, anything else that's in there. I've also got the dry beans that are grown somewhere in there. So, like, for example, the tomatoes are the ones that I'm most concerned about rotation because they're the ones most prone to disease because I usually use straight heirlooms. And so what happens with those, you saw how I have those in strips. And so it's not every 4 years they're in the same spot. It's going to average out to every 7 or 8. Because when I get back to that same spot where the tomatoes or the eggplants or the peppers would be, they're not going to be planted over the same row. They're going to be shifted over. So if I had the tomatoes on this end, I'm going to shift them all the way over. And then they're going to be planted over top of where that living cover row would have been the previous time. So the same type of plant is not going to be, the same tomato plant is not going to be planted where another tomato plant was for at least 8 years or more. So.
Do you ever interspecies with your garden?
So you mean like onions and tomatoes that are close together? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, it's onions and I forget
Yeah.
what it is. Other plants that they say,
Yep. I don't do a lot of that. I probably could. I guess I'm putting the diversity in through my cover crop and then what else I've got in there. At my home garden, I do more of that. So like I don't do onions at the larger garden. Onions and those types of things are more in my home garden, and that is pretty dense. My home garden is planted pretty dense. I've got lots of different plants that are really close together. So I don't know if I'd call it intercropping, but they're so close together that it practically is. Yes, back there.
I was wondering if you've ever considered trying, like, throwing down wood chips and inoculating with vine cap mushrooms.
So I have not, just because my compost works so well for me. And I've got an easy source of it. Technically, there's the wood chips that are in the compost that I get from the city. Now it's not, they're thermal, so there's not much of the fungal degradation that's happening there like you would get with the system you're talking about. I don't know, I'm open to a lot of things. It's just that my system works so well for me that I'm going to try on small scale before I try and adopt new things. So, yeah, saw another hand go up.
Is there any way to stimulate a poor stand of wild asparagus?
So I do have asparagus. I don't know if you saw. I didn't really mention that. I have asparagus and rhubarb. What I have found is so keep in mind, we are not market gardeners. I am not selling, so I'm not trying to completely maximize. So what I do with our asparagus stand is I harvest maybe 50% on any given year. And so the ones I do not harvest go all the way through their whole growth stage. And then what happens then is I leave that stand, I mulch that down, mow that over early in the spring before the asparagus starts going. And that's how I kind of regenerate my asparagus stand every year. It works for me, but if you're trying to maximize production, I don't know if that's going to work for you. What I have heard of some people doing is when the stand, if you got a patch of it, it starts to thin out, is that you can actually thin it out even further or shift it over to another spot with the same plant. So you're going to dig up those below ground rhizomes that are under there, and then you can shift them over. I don't know. I'm not an asparagus expert. I just
Competition with the grass.
yeah. See, and I don't have grass within mine, but I think the grass is probably what's your biggest competition is what's reducing your asparagus stand would be my guess. It does grow out in the pasture, and that's
Yeah.
where, yeah,
And in the ditches, and there's tons of grass there.
yeah, I've got a coworker that actually has a map of where it grows in the ditches around here on, and that's his asparagus harvesting system. So, yeah.
Well, if you guys want to continue the conversation, I'm sure Kent will stick around, or you can catch him a little bit later.
Yep.
But if you need to get back to your other session, now would be probably a good time.
Thank you. Great questions, everyone.